What's up, guys? This is Juan, how to media with Empower Homes, and today we're going to be talking about appraisals. So, what every realtor needs to know about appraisals. What exactly are we going to get into with appraisals today? Let's talk about it. So, what is an appraisal? Who orders and pays for the appraisal? FHA, or the differences between FHA versus conventional versus VA versus USDA. There are very key differences, which we're going to get into today. Something that you should let your clients know about. Should you order a pre-listing appraisal? That's a great question. And what happens if the appraisal is over or under the purchase price? And last but not least, when to recommend an appraisal, right? And then we'll end it with a couple tips for you guys to take home with you and be able to better represent your clients. That's really what all this is about at the end of the day, huh? All right. What is an appraisal? So, an appraisal essentially determines a property's fair market value. Now, keep this in mind. The person doing an appraisal is going to use a lot of the same statistics and go way into more detail than you might in your CMA. So it's a crap ton of paper, a crap ton of work, to be honest with you. And so it can be very useful, but at the end of the day, it's an opinion. I've actually so keep in mind that I've actually had differences between FHA and conventional appraisals of about $20,000 difference of value. So, a human is still doing it, so keep that in mind, right? The human doesn't know the future. You can only use historical data when even doing a CMA or an appraisal. These are things that you want to keep in mind when getting an appraisal done or when recommending one, to be honest. All right, required by most lenders to ensure a home is worth the loan amount. So I used to think that if you did 20% down payment, that the lender wouldn't require a an appraisal, which is actually not true. It depends. There's more variables than just 20% down. However, it is true that sometimes, and I don't even know if 20% down is actually a requirement, but sometimes, depending on the borrower's situation, and how strong of a borrower they might be, or how much down payment, or essentially how much risk the lender perceives or the bank perceives the borrower to be, it can be waived. The appraisal can be waived. Now, why would you want to waive an appraisal? Um, to have a more competitive offer, right? Again, back to my first point, where an appraisal is still an opinion, technically, and so maybe the buyer's opinion is different than the appraisal. That's just a risk that always exists. So to avoid that and to have a stronger offer, then you might want to consider not having an appraisal contingency. Now, in this market, do you want to avoid the appraisal contingency or not? Are there that many multiple offer situations? Probably not, but I guess it depends on when you're watching this video, because it might. 2019, 2020, it was nuts. You definitely didn't want an appraisal contingency. But nowadays, it's not a big deal. Conducted by a licensed appraisal. That's another big differentiator. They are licensed. They do have to go through a course on becoming an appraisal. Okay, who orders and pays for the appraisal? The lender orders the appraisal. Now, it's important to know when, because every lender is a little different. Some do it out of the gates. Some do it after a certain after a certain period. So, keep that in mind, especially depending on the transaction. If it's a quick close, if it's a short close, you want to keep that in mind. So, don't be afraid to ask your lender. The buyer typically pays for it. Costs range from $400 to $700. Very important to let them know. Usually, it's closing cost at closing day, or used to be. Now, most of the time, they're requiring the buyer or the borrower to pay for it before they even order it. Like, in order for them to order it, you have to pay for it. That happens a lot of the times. Some lenders will bite that bullet, especially, again, going back to if the borrower is a strong buyer or something like that, or it seems like a strong deal. The lender might eat that cost and then charge you at closing day, but most of the time this is going to come out of your buyer's pocket before the day of closing. So keep that in mind. So what are the differences between FHA versus conventional versus USDA versus VA? So that's a lot of different programs, and it's also different with different, let's say, non-traditional loans. You want to keep that in mind. But anyways, FHA appraisals tend to be more strict, more I can't pronounce that word. essentially, I'd say more strict than the conventional loan. I'll give you an example. If you do a conventional loan, which actually is the next one, if you do a conventional loan, most of the time they want to make sure that the home has a heating system and that the heating system can heat the home up to, I believe it's 65 degrees. If it heats the home up to 65 degrees, that home can just about be falling apart. Because I've actually done a deal conventional loan where that house was, that is it, you had to tear that house up. But it had a heating system and it could heat the house up until 65 degrees, and so you're good to go. But one caveat may be in the summertime. How do you test that there's a heating system that can heat the home up to 65 degrees? You really can't. So keep that in mind too as the buyer, what kind of risks they are when you're buying in the summertime. Now you can really test the HVAC system, which you can't do in the wintertime. So little caveats there, little details there to keep in mind when you're inspecting the home. And sorry, to my first point is FHA appraisals. If there is paint kind of like coming off the exterior of the home or anything like that, you're screwed. If there is like a shelter outside of the home, but it's in the property, it's part of the property, and that seems to be kind of falling apart, you're screwed. Like that, I don't mean to say you're screwed, but they're gonna ask you to fix those items 100% before the day of closing. There's always ways to get around, not to get around it, but to make that deal happen, as long as the seller is open to fixing those items before closing. But those items are going to have to be fixed, or you're going to have to figure that out. It's much more likely that the FHA will come back and ask for items to be fixed than a conventional loan. And then the VA loan, they're actually they're qualified for VA appraisals. It's very similar to FHA, is what I've been told. However, in my experience, VA can be even more stricter than FHA. And this is why back in 2019, 2020, 2021, if you had a VA loan, it was very hard to find a home, especially if it was multiple offers, because sellers didn't want the extra risk of the VA appraisal. And so, nowadays it's not a huge deal. VA loan is not, it doesn't seem to be as much of a let's say disadvantage, because it's a great program for the veterans, that those who can qualify for it. However, those are the risks that you want to be aware of. Okay, what's next? And the USDA loan. USDA appraisals seem to be very similar to FHA appraisals. I think the other thing is it needs to be in a rural area. So if you have a buyer that is a USDA pre-approved, make sure that the homes they like, go to their website, USDA website. You can actually see if they're eligible for a USDA loan. Because last thing you want them to fall in love with a home that doesn't qualify for your USDA, and that's just lack of preparation at that point. Probably should have never gone to see the home. And while keep in mind, while the conventional loan won't doesn't usually require repairs, it is possible. With all these loans, it's unlikely that they will require repairs. It really depends on what side of the bed the appraiser woke up on that morning, but also the condition. More importantly, the condition of the property itself. So keep that in mind. Okay. What happens if the appraisal is over or under the purchase price? Well, if it's over the purchase price, go ahead and celebrate. You got more equity in the home. Now, why is that important? You might ask yourself. Well, most of the time it's because if you get to 20%, specifically for conventional, if you get to 20% equity, you don't have to pay for PMI anymore. So if you have more equity on the home, it's just going to be, you're just going to get to that 20% sooner than you would have otherwise. And I think the other important thing about equity is it's just your net worth. So your net worth is just a little bit higher, which is always a good thing. um, Under purchase price. So if the appraisal is under purchase price, what are your options there? So you can either have the buyer cover the difference. You can either have the seller lower their price. Most of the time they will, but in a few times they don't. And then you can either come to negotiate a middle ground, or you can terminate the contract. 9 out of 10 times, you're going to have a finance contingency there. Um, the couple times that you might not, that you want to be aware of, is new construction. A lot of these new construction loans don't have an appraisal contingency. And so in the contract, most of the time I'll say, unless it's a VA loan, because VA loans, I believe, are required to have that appraisal contingency. Other than VA loan, I believe the rest of them, if it doesn't appraise, the buyer would be on the hook. Now, the way the builder will tell you is, hey, we most of the time we just let them slide and it's no big deal. Yeah, but what if they decide not to let you slide that day? That's just a risk that you want to be aware of, so that you let your clients know. So you at least are guiding your clients in the right way, setting the right expectations in case that 1 out of 10 chance does occur. You've at least let them know that's a possibility. Now, when is the most likely that doesn't appraise in new construction? It doesn't happen too often now, but back in the day where you could essentially choose all the upgrades you wanted for the home, some builders do let you do that now. What if you do a ton of different upgrades? I think when my dad bought a home, I think he put like 80K worth of upgrades. Now that's a huge risk for not just my dad, but for the builder, for that to not appraise, because a lot of these upgrades aren't gonna help the home value increase by any means, right? Sometimes it's a better kitchen package, better appliance package, washer and dryer, things like that. That just gets tacked into the purchase price, but that's not adding value to the home, right? Or a different colored granite, a different colored floor. It might be the same. It might look great, but it might be the same quality floor. So it might help the value of the home come some, but not as much as what they're charging you. So those are different caveats, different things that you want to keep an eye out for, especially when you're doing new construction or really any kind of transaction, that your clients are more aware of those situations. Okay, when to recommend an appraisal outside of it being required. So if pricing a unique property, yeah, that's a big one, especially like a luxury 1 out of 1, or it doesn't even have to be luxury, but just a 1 out of 1 type of property. Maybe it has a ton of acreage. Maybe it's just completely custom. You probably want to do a listing, or an appraisal. You probably want to do an appraisal for those, 1,000%. When a seller wants a strong justification for their list price. That's another one. If the seller is maybe a high C, and we'll do a video of the disc assessment one day, but maybe a high C, very analytical, and just wants to make sure they get the most, not that everybody doesn't want to make sure, but they want to have some kind of justification for their list price. So if a buyer comes in, trusts to lowball them, they say, hey, F you, look at this appraisal. That can be a sense of justification of the list price. Now, don't forget what I said in the beginning of the video, where appraisal is still kind of an opinion. It's just a well backed up opinion based off historical evidence. So, keep that in mind. Okay. And for cash deals, when an appraisal contingency is optional. So if you have a cash deal, obviously you don't have to have an appraisal contingency, that you might when you have a loan. So maybe a cash deal, maybe just want some more certainty to make sure that what they're offering, is at least market value or less. And that if that's the case, some investors, or most of the time some cash buyers, would like to have an appraisal. So you want to have somebody in your Rolodex or in your contacts. I'm too young for a Rolodex. I've never owned one myself, but in your contacts list, you want to have a vendor that's an appraisal that's trustworthy, that you can reach out to at a moment's notice, for sure. All right. Should you order a pre-listing appraisal? Here are a few pros and cons. So a few pros, kind of how we mentioned earlier. Justification is a justification for the price of the home or the value of the home. Helps price the home accurately, can justify value to the buyers and lenders, and useful for unique or luxury properties. So more importantly, the cons is it's costly. I mean, it can cost $500 to $600 for sure. And if the property is huge, it probably costs a little bit more than that, right? So you want to keep that in mind. Buyer's lender may still require the loan, or an appraisal. Sorry, but the buyer's lender may still require an appraisal. And like I mentioned earlier, I've had appraisal from FHA to conventional be about $20,000 difference. So you know you want to keep that in mind. So that's still a risk that could happen. Okay, and final tips for realtors: prepare your seller for potential appraisal contingencies. Let them know what that means. A lot of the times, what I mentioned is you have to sell the home twice, once to buyers, once to the bank, right? So we can't just hope and pray for a buyer that just loves your home and is open to overpricing your home, because the appraisal contingency will come in and just get you. So even in something to keep in mind here also is Even if you get an extremely, let's say you're a multiple offer situation, you have an offer at $50,000 over asking, that appraisal contingency is still there without an appraisal gap. And for those who don't know, an appraisal gap essentially means whatever the, let's say the appraised value is, if it appraises within 10K of the purchase price, they will make good on the difference up to 10K. So if it appraises, I hope I explained that right. If it appraises at 100, the purchase price is 110, the buyer is automatically responsible for making up that difference. Now, if it appraises for 90K, they would still go up to 10K. So then they would be responsible for a $100,000 purchase, and then you'd have to negotiate and figure that out. So make sure your sellers understand the risks of the appraisal contingency. Um, Provide appraisers with strong comps. So you can actually provide appraisers with comps yourself. If the appraisal comes back and let's say it's lower than what you expect, you can push back on the appraisal's value and then submit comps that you feel like are stronger than the comps that they used in order to justify the value for your sellers. You can 100% do that. Now, it's about a I've been told it's about 2 or 3% that they'll actually change their opinion. So it's very tough for them to actually change their opinion. But I have had it happen before, so it is possible. And then understand how appraisal contingencies work in contracts. And then again, set the right expectations with your sellers on how they work. Communicate openly with buyers and sellers about options. I think the more you do real estate, the more you really understand a lot of the problems come up is when you set the wrong expectations, or when you don't communicate clearly enough. 90% of the problems that occur in real estate has been that. Now, there's also things that are out of our control, and so for that I would recommend just kind of believe there's a higher being that's controlling things, and everything's going to work out at the very end. Because if you really try to control every aspect of this business, you are going to drive yourself up, down a hole, I guess. I forget what the saying is, but it could really affect you mentally. So, and that's something I've had to deal with a lot, is kind of control what I can, and then that's out of my control, just believe there's a higher power that has a plan. And that's my soapbox for today. All right, guys. Well, for everybody watched all throughout it, thank you so much for watching it. Again, this is Juan Jaramillo, with a team lead here with Empower Homes at Real Broker. So if you're ever interested in a different real estate opportunity, different brokerage, different team, different culture, if you're ever interested in anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be below. And for everybody else, hopefully you guys got some really good value out of this video. Hope you guys have a great day.